Good evening. I am Professor Tim Fuller in the Political Science Department at the college, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to the 14th William P. Carey Nobel Laureate in Economics Lecture. William P. Carey, who is sadly no longer with us, made this series possible through a generous benefaction. And he regularly attended these lectures himself until his health no longer permitted him to do so. But we are fortunate to have with us his representative Jan Kerst and Chris Franklin from the William P. Carey Foundation. Jan is our own graduate who is really the inspiration originally for the development of this series. Bill Carey was an exemplary businessman and philanthropist who made many contributions in support of the study of economics and business in major colleges and universities, and he also contributed significantly to secondary education as well. These lectures were inaugurated by Lawrence Klein of the University of Pennsylvania, and since then we have been honored by the presence of Kenneth Arrow, James Tobin, Franco Modigliani, Robert Fogel, James Heckman, who is also a graduate of Colorado College, class of '65, George Akerlof, Douglas North, Clive Granger, Thomas Schelling, Edward Prescott, Roger Meyerson, and most recently, Robert Solow. And tonight, we are honored once more, this time by the presence of Amartya Sen. Now, it's customary in introductions of this sort to provide an extensive list of the speaker's accomplishments. Professor Sen's accomplishments are so many and so great that I will mention only a few of them as an encouragement for you to investigate further. He is currently the Thomas W. Lamont University Professor and Professor of Economics at Harvard and a Senior Fellow at the Harvard Society of Fellows. Before that, he was the Master of Trinity College, Cambridge. He's been associated with numerous universities in India, with Oxford, the London School of Economics, and at many other leading universities, and has served as the president of at least half a dozen professional societies. And his research has extended to the theory of social choice, seminal work on the nature of famines, econometrics, the economics of development, and welfare economics, for which he won the Nobel Prize in 1998. His books, which have been translated into more than 30 languages, include Choice of Techniques, Collective Choice and Social Welfare, Choice, Welfare and Measurement, Commodities and Capabilities, The Standard of Living, Development as Freedom, Identity and Violence, The Illusion of Destiny, and The Idea of Justice. Professor Sen is a student of the idea of justice in the history of political philosophy, both East and West, and especially from Adam Smith to John Stuart Mill to John Rawls and other contemporary thinkers. His work is well known to us at Colorado College. Many of our students read widely in his works. And I will give one local example. For a number of years, I've taught a course called The Foundations of Political Economy, which begins with reading of Adam Smith's Theory of Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations, after which we examine the development of economic thinking up to the present, and at the end, we look back at Smith's arguments in contemporary context. Among the works we have considered is Professor Sen's Development as Freedom. This is a work which combines in a powerful way basic principles of economics with political philosophy, invoking Adam Smith in contemporary context. And he says in the acknowledgments to this book, he acknowledges the contribution of his wife, Emma Rothschild, herself a distinguished Smith scholar. He says, "This book draws a great deal on Smith's analyses. I had a close relationship with Adam Smith even before I knew Emma." And he goes on to argue in a manner Adam Smith, I think, would recognize. I'm quoting now from Development as Freedom. There is a deep complementarity between individual agency and social arrangements. We have to see individual freedom as a social commitment. Expansion of freedom is viewed in this approach both as the primary end and as the principal means of development. There is strong evidence that economic and political freedom help to reinforce one another. Economic growth cannot sensibly be treated as an end in itself. Development has to be more concerned with enhancing the lives we lead and the freedoms we know. But he is also Aristotelian, as we see in the following passage from the same book. He says, "To be generically against markets would be almost as odd as being generically against conversation between people. The freedom to exchange words or goods or gifts does not need defensive justification. They are part of the way human beings in society live and interact with each other. The contribution of the market mechanism to economic growth is, of course, important, but this comes only after the direct significance of freedom to interchange words, goods, gifts has been acknowledged." Professor Sen thus engages in reflection and dialogue that is both ancient and modern, both economic, political, and philosophical, and from a global perspective. It's hard to imagine anyone who can be more enlightening on the topic of global justice. He will answer questions at the conclusion of these remarks. So please join me in welcoming our honored guest, Amartya Sen.
Well, I first must say I'm very deeply honored to be here and to give this W.P Carey Memorial Lecture, and also to be in this campus, about whom I've been hearing a lot from my friend Jim Heckman. He's somewhat biased, since this is where he cut his intellectual teeth. But day and a half, I have to say, it lived up to my expectations tremendously, particularly very stimulating discussion I had with the students, some of whom I see here. And so I'm very grateful, thank you. But before I launch on the speech, I have a request to make. I find it very eerie to speak to a darkened audience, because, you know, many of us judge. I mean, I can't give a proper talk without seeing the extent of skepticism in the faces of the people. And so, is there any way of getting a bit of light here? Yeah, because I think of lectures as interactive. But turn the lights up. I don't think your command is being as effective as it should be. There may be a problem now. Well, there's somebody up there, I know. Yeah, okay. That's it gives me enough. That's the kind of thing that I could tell if it's not darkened that I have to be closer to microphone. There is a secret about that. Actually, a nightclub singer once told me that you have to recognize that this proximity has to be very strong. You have to go as if you're about to kiss the microphone without actually kissing it. And that's the ideal position. But it's not so easy here with the, let me see whether I can get it closer. So, thank you very much. The title of the talk, I don't know whether it was announced as Global Justice, yeah? It is announced, okay, good. That was Jim Heckman's suggestion, that's what I should talk about. The global economic crisis that we have just experienced erupted with some suddenness in the second half of 2008. Even though the rapidly aggravating crisis was halted in 2009, The removal of some of the worst aspects of the recession, unemployment in particular, has been distressingly slow. While the fortunes of some opulent persons have suffered sharp declines, the most affected have in general been people who are at the bottom of the pyramid in their respective countries and in the world. Families who are already worse placed to face any further adversity have often suffered most from still greater deprivation in the form of lasting unemployment, loss of housing and shelter, loss of medical care, and other deprivations that have reduced the lives of hundreds of millions of people across the world. We can appreciate the severity of the current global crisis only by examining what's happening to the lives of human beings, especially the less privileged people, their well-being and their freedoms to lead decent human lives. We cannot assess the severity of the problem by looking only at the gross national product and other indicators that focus on inanimate objects of convenience, though they are important in their own context, rather than looking at human freedom, its extent and tangibility, and its deprivation, decline, and decimation. Am I all right with the microphone now? Yeah? Okay? If any time you raise two hands, I would know that I'm not. Okay? Thank you. The crisis had not been confined to any particular country, even though the incidence of it had varied from country to country. It's clearly a global phenomenon, affecting the population of the world to varying extents. In determining how to think about these issues in a way that our sense of justice, our reasoned sense of justice may demand, we need an understanding of justice that is not confined only to the citizen of a particular country. A narrowness that is, I would argue, a characteristic of many traditional and modern theories of justice. In fact, there's no particular argument for incarcerating our large minds in little boxes. Our minds have the capacity to be very broad in outlook and comprehension, and our reflection can be further broadened by the use of our capacity to reason. If this talk is an instigation to have more discussion of global justice, it's also an invitation to make more use of our reasoning, especially interactive public reasoning, in pursuit of that objective. In this lecture, I shall draw on a book of mine called The Idea of Justice, which I published a few years ago. I've tried to suggest there the need for a departure from prevailing understanding of justice, a departure not merely from mainstream theories of justice in contemporary political philosophy, but also from the long tradition spanning several centuries of situating the analysis of justice in the framework of a so-called social contract, a term that has been had much use in social contracts since Thomas Hobbes' time. This way of seeing justice is woven in different ways around the idea of an imagined contract that the population of a state are supposed, or indeed imagined, to have endorsed and embraced. And the argument is they could have with reason. The social contract approach concentrates on identifying perfectly just social arrangements, taking the characterization of quote-unquote just institution, along with correspondingly compliant human behavior, to be the principal and often the only identified task of the theory of justice. This approach was pioneered by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century, and major contributions were made in this line of thinking by John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Immanuel Kant, among others. Though Kant's reasoning, and I think I'm not revealing much bias here, I hope not, Kant's reasoning, which is really much more foundational than any of the other names I've mentioned, Kant's reasoning on ethics and political philosophy had many other elements as well on which we can draw, even if we do not wish to take the social contract route, as I myself have done or have not done. In ambiguity, I mean that as I have not done. The contractarian approach has been the dominant influence also in contemporary political philosophy, led by the most prominent political philosophy of our time, and I believe the greatest, namely John Rawls, whose classic book, A Theory of Justice, published in 1971, includes a definitive statement of the social contract approach to justice. The principal theories of justice in contemporary political philosophy, coming not only from Rawls, but also from Robert Nozick, Ronald Dworkin, David Gauthier, and many others, though different from each other in specific content, and they can be quite divergent, draw in general and together on the social contract approach and concentrate on the search for ideal social institutions, the institution that Dworkin seeks very different from Rawls, Nozick seeks are different from Gauthier, and so on. But they're all looking for ideal institutions at some level. In contrast with contractarian theorists, a number of other Enlightenment thinkers, beginning with Adam Smith, I think the most two prominent names there would be Adam Smith and Marquis de Condorcet from France, and perhaps the most neglected philosopher on political philosophy of all time, namely Mary Wollstonecraft. And then it extended later in the following century to John Stuart Mill and Karl Marx, among others. They took a variety of approaches that differed in many ways from each other, again, but shared a common interest in making comparisons between different ways in which people's lives may go, jointly influenced by the working of institutions, but not just that, people's actual behavior, their social interactions, and other factors that significantly impact on what actually happens in the world in which we live. The analytical and the rather mathematical discipline of social choice theory, which had its origin in the works of French mathematicians in the 18th century, in particular Marquis de Condorcet, but also others like Jean-Charles de Borda, and which has been revived and reformulated in our time by one of the Carey lecturers, namely Kenneth Arrow, belongs robustly to this second line of investigation. I have to confess I've been very involved in the development and use of social choice theory. You kindly referred to my Nobel. It said wealth economics, but most of the citations are from social choice theory, in fact. I focus particularly on the exploration on the constructive possibilities of the approach, going beyond in that particular respect from Kenneth Arrow's focus on generating impossibility results. And I have been involved over some decades in the derivation and elucidation of the demands of justice with the help of the mathematical discipline of social choice theory, but supplemented by general and largely non-mathematical political and moral reasoning. In this lecture, I want to pursue, in general and particularly in the context of global justice, this departure, making use of the insights of non-contractarian Enlightenment thinkers, such as Adam Smith, Condorcet, Wollstonecraft, and also lines of reasoning pursued in social choice theory. There are three principal departures of this non-contractarian approach on which I want to concentrate in this presentation. First, rather than following the contractarian tradition of beginning the exercise by asking what is perfect justice, or what principles should govern the choice of perfectly just institutions for the society, I argue for following Condorcet and Smith and Wollstonecraft in asking about the identification of clear cases of injustice on which agreement could emerge on the basis of public reasoning. In arguing, for example, for the abolition of slavery, as both Marquis de Condorcet, all Marquis de Condorcet, Adam Smith, Mary Wollstonecraft did, they did not have to seek an agreement on the nature of a perfectly just society. I think on that, Smith's view and Condorcet's view and Mary Wollstonecraft's view would have been quite different, but that wasn't not needed to agree that slavery should be abolished as a priority. And similarly, they didn't need an agreement on the characteristics of ideally just social institutions. So I would argue that the Rawlsian theory and all the other theories I'm mentioning begins with the wrong question. Wrong question not because it's irrelevant, but that's not the starting point of thinking about justice. We can agree on the manifest injustice of particular institutions and behavior patterns, even without having the same view of ideally just society or perfectly just institutions. Second, our focus need not be only on institutions, in contrast with the social contract approach, which does concentrate on institutions. I'm not grumbling about that. I mean, I think it was a great definitive moment in world intellectual history that when Thomas Hobbes talked about the need for institutions to make a world which is not nasty, brutish, and short of lives. And people often forget. And he talked about people's isolation from each other. So, these are major things. But the question is that all there should be. After all, he was beginning it many centuries ago. We can go beyond institutions, important as they are, to pay direct attention to the nature of the lives that people are actually able to lead and the actual freedoms they enjoy, which would depend on a variety of influences, not just institutions. Third, unlike the social contract approach, which by construction must be confined to the people of a particular state, a sovereign state as Hobbes would put it, the alternative approach I'm trying to present can involve people from anywhere in the world. Since the focus is on reasoned agreement, quite often partial agreement, on certain identifiable features of injustice, rather than on a state-based social contract to install ideal institutions for a given state. The departure makes reasoning on global justice possible and momentous. And this is essential for addressing such problems as the global economic crisis, or global warming, or prevention and management of global pandemics, such as the AIDS epidemic, and many other issues. Our agreements may be only partial, even after as much reasoning as we can have across the boundaries of states. But that's true even within each country itself. And the ways and means of implementation of reasoned agreement can also involve considerable plurality. Mary Wollstonecraft had pioneering discussions on how the rights of women and of men in her first book, men and women generally in the first book, can be pursued not just through the laws of a sovereign state, but also by many other means, including public discussion and the focus of the media. One of the ways in which I think Mary Wollstonecraft was a pioneering thinker. Of the different features of contrast between a social contract approach and a social choice approach, the distinction between the focus on institutions and arrangements in the former and on more fully considered social realizations in the latter may demand some explanatory discussion. In understanding the contrast between an arrangement-focused and a realization-focused view of justice, it's useful to invoke an old distinction. I think it's useful to invoke the old distinction from the Sanskrit literature on ethics and jurisprudence. I have to say, when I was asked today, I think you asked, what did I want to read when I was at school? So my main conflict was maths and Sanskrit, two subjects I liked most. I still do, I think. I taught a course in maths last year, postgraduate maths course. I haven't dared to teach a course in Sanskrit yet, and I think I probably would be less good at it too. Consider two different words, both standing for justice in classical Sanskrit. Sanskrit has about or 10 or 15 words for justice, but these are niti and nyaya. Among the principal users of the term niti are organizational propriety and behavioral correctness. In contrast with niti, the term nyaya stands for a comprehensive concept of realized justice in the lives of people. In that line of vision, the roles of institutions, rules, and organization remain important, but important as they are, they have to be assessed in the broader and more inclusive perspective of nyaya, which is inescapably linked with the world that actually emerges, not just the institutions or rules we happen to have. To consider a particular application, early legal theorists talked disparagingly about what they call matsya nyaya. I should explain, matsya in Sanskrit is fish, nyaya is what I would say. So justice in the world of fish. And this is stylized as a justice where a big fish is free to devour a small fish whenever it wants it. We are warned that avoiding matsya nyaya must be an essential part of justice. And it's crucial to make sure that the justice of fish is not allowed to invade the world of human beings. The term is repeatedly invoked. The last began around 3rd, 4th century BC, after Buddha, but shortly after Buddha. But then the last reference I saw was the 9th century, when the Pala dynasty was being established, and after winning the kingdom, including my part, namely Bengal, the emperor says, this is the end of matsya nyaya. Very big statement. The central recognition here is that the realization of justice in the sense of nyaya is not just a matter of judging institutions and rules, but of judging societies themselves. Let me consider an example, which I pursued more extensively in my book, The Idea of Justice, to make the distinction between niti and nyaya clear. Ferdinand I, the Holy Roman Emperor, famously claimed in the 16th century, fiat justitia et feriat mundus, which can be translated as, let justice be done, though the world perish. This severe maxim could figure as a niti, an extremely austere niti, that is advocated by some. Indeed, Emperor Ferdinand did precisely that. However, when we understand justice in the broader form of niti, it would be impossible to accommodate a total catastrophe as an example of a just world. If indeed the world does perish, there would be nothing much to celebrate in that accomplishment, even though the stern and severe niti leading to this extreme result could conceivably be defended with very sophisticated arguments of different and rather austere kind based on the nature of the niti. As the example of matsya nyaya also makes clear, the subject of justice is not merely about trying to achieve or dreaming about achieving some perfectly just society or social arrangements, but about preventing manifestly severe injustice, such as avoiding the dreadful state of matsya nyaya. And this is an important point which came up in today's discussion over lunch, that at any moment we might get agreement on certain things, but not on others. Matsya nyaya was an agreement that suddenly, arbitrarily, couldn't be devoured by a bigger fish. On the other hand, matsya nyaya, where you don't do it, but you can still be put in your own place. The caste system are compatible with matsya nyaya. It's arguing against the arbitrariness, the uncertainties of life. You have to know your own position. But if the elimination of caste system is a part of your system of justice, as indeed it is in the Indian constitution, it's actually, the practice is meant to be illegal, even though many illegal practices are still practiced. But that, of course, is not a subject on which you would have got an agreement in that society at that time. For example, when people agitated for the abolition of slavery in the 18th and 19th centuries, They were not laboring under the illusion that the abolition of slavery would make the world perfectly just, or even that it would make the social institutions perfectly just. It was their claim, rather, that a society with slavery was totally unjust. Among the authors mentioned, they were all gave Smith, Condorcet, Wollstonecraft argued tellingly in that direction. It was the diagnosis of an intolerable justice in slavery that made abolition an overwhelming priority, and this did not require the search for a consensus on what a perfectly just society would look like, the Rawlsian question that animates the theory of justice of John Rawls, and indeed Dworkin and Nozick and all the others I quoted. Those who think reasonably enough that the American Civil War, which led to the abolition of slavery, was a big strike for justice in America, would have to be reconciled to the fact that not much can be said on this in the perspective of social contract theory. Of course, no reasoned theory of perfectly just institutions would include slavery among them, but nor would they include a great many other institutions that were untouched by the civil wars, and indeed would include many that remain much in force even today. We need a comparative approach that can identify the benefits from the removal of a particular injustice, even though the world after that removal would still not be, in any obvious sense, perfectly just. What are the consequences of changing the focus of attention from searching for just institutions to seeking the removal of injustice in the lives that people are actually able to lead? The question that immediately arises is how to understand the richness and poverty of human lives. The approach I've tried to pursue has largely focused on freedom, the actual freedom that people enjoy, what kind of lives they are really free to lead. This differs sharply from many other approaches to assessing the demands of justice, including looking for the fulfillment of certain formal rights, including just libertarian rights, no matter how deprived the lives of people might be, even after fulfilling these rights. An approach based on substantive freedom must insist that we scrutinize and assess different features of human lives and their combination, and that a person has the opportunity to consider and actually choose from. This takes us naturally enough beyond the domain of formal rights, on which the institutional perspective of libertarian philosophy, which is a very broad philosophy, tends to focus, and focus exclusively. Not all libertarian philosophy, but the institutional perspective of that. The critical issue is not, I should emphasize, the importance of liberty and other entitlements that we have reason to see as rights. Nothing can sensibly take away their genuine importance. Liberty is really important, and I count myself in that respect as a libertarian to that extent. The crucial issue is whether there are also other valuable concerns that have legitimacy and relevance in our reasoned ethics, which cannot be overridden by the allegedly irresistible force of considerations of liberty and other recognized rights. The argument here is for an ethical force that takes important note of liberty, but also goes beyond that. If the requirement to respect but go beyond institutional libertarianism is one necessity of the approach I'm trying to present, the need to go beyond the mental matrix of utilities in the form of pleasures or desire fulfillment is surely another important issue. The evaluative exercise of taking note of people's actual freedoms cannot be avoided by concentrating instead only on some features of people's mental reactions, such as pleasures, happiness, desire fulfillment, as utilitarians from Jeremy Bentham onwards have proposed. John Stuart Mill is the exception to this, while belonging to the utilitarian tradition. And I think this is mainly because he was, Mill, much more than a utilitarian. I learned from Richard Reeve's excellent biography of John Stuart Mill that when Mill was 15, he was very tempted by the narrowly utilitarian view. And 15 does seem like a very good age to be a full-time utilitarian. Even if a chronically deprived person, for example, a precarious landless laborer, subjugated housewife, or a chronically unemployed laid-off worker, learn to accept cheerfully their deprived lifestyles, and underprivileged people without hope of liberation from their deprivation often try to do that, just that, to cope with the inescapability of the deprivation involved. Even then, that cultivated cheerfulness will not eliminate the real deprivation from which they will continue to suffer. Taking pleasure in small mercies may well be a very intelligent thing to do for a person's strategy of living with little hope of redemption. But that does not make the real deprivation, jobs, education, health care, absence of insecurity, evaporate and vanish. How does all this apply to global justice? It's not hard to see that global justice, I haven't seen any two hands yet. Is all right? That global justice demands many reforms. It's very easy to think that, and many new institutions and practices. But the mere identification of the perfectly just society, inspiring as it might be, would not tell us much about what to do to pursue the advance of justice in the world in which we live. Indeed, the concentration on the social contract approach has had, I would argue, a seriously negative effect on practical discussion of justice in general and of global justice in particular. We can think of many changes that would manifestly advance world justice as we see it. Elimination of famine, pandemics, the rampage of illiteracy, the subjugation of women across the world, without getting us into the perfectly just world or giving us perfectly just institutions for that change alone for which we may be arguing. However, that kind of discussion on the removal of global justice would appear to be just loose talk to those who are persuaded by the Hobbesian Rawlsian claim that justice is really about the perfectly just institution, and that we need a fully sovereign state to apply the principles of justice with its extensive institutional requirement, which only a sovereign state can bring about. Consider the strongly argued dismissal of the relevance of the idea of global justice by one of the finest contemporary philosophers, whom I admire greatly, who's also a personal friend, I would say, namely Thomas Nagel, from whose work I've learned so many things, despite our disagreement on this particular issue. Nagel's arguments draw on his understanding that there are extensive institutional demands to think cogently about justice, which means perfect justice, which cannot be met at the global level at this time. As Tom Nagel puts it, I quote from Tom, it seems to me very difficult to resist Hobbes' claim about the relation between justice and sovereignty. And if Hobbes is right, the idea of global justice without a world government is a chimera, unquote. In the global context, Nagel chooses, therefore, to concentrate on clarifying other demands, such as those of minimal humanitarian morality, which are distinguishable from the demands of justice as such. Similarly, in the classic approach to justice developed by John Rawls, the application of Rawls's theory of justice as fairness requires an extensive cluster of institutions that determine what we call the basic structure of a fully just society. Well, there's no such world government to bring that about. Not surprisingly, Rawls actually abandons his own principles of justice when it comes to assessment and how to go about thinking about global justice. And he proceeds then to concentrate on humanitarian behavior and respect for human rights, which is very much sort of an advancement of justice in different ways in which one could have. Thus, the theory of justice as formulated under the social contract approach reduces many of the most relevant issues of justice in the world as being simply non-issue, as being inadmissible when it seems to be a lot more strongly needed. This is a huge pity. When people across the world agitate to get more global justice, they are not clamoring for some kind of minimum humanitarianism. In an alternative view of justice that I'm trying to explore here, our concentration has to be on global reasoning, particularly public discussion on what should be done. We do not have any dearth of problems to consider and address. The overwhelming problems of poverty, hunger, illiteracy, persistent medical neglect, and consistent deprivation of the environment in which we live. Epidemics rage over helpless people in different parts of the globe. Even in rich countries, the unemployed and the medically insecure can lead very austere and deprived lives. There are also issues of global warming, to prevent which some people want to go for the option of nuclear power. And yet, as the Fukushima disaster in Japan has really recently brought out very sharply, this can add insecurity of a very different kind in human lives, even as it helps to reduce the strain on the global atmosphere. The problems of accident, the problems of global terrorism, the problems of nuclear theft, there's the problem of non-nuclear war, in which one party simply bombs a nuclear power plant, which could generate massively destructive consequences. And there's also the problem of what to do with the nuclear waste, which will continue to accumulate if that becomes our principal, or one of the principal sources of energy. All these subjects are eminently suitable for public discussion across the borders on how the world can be securely and sustainably improved, rather than how the world could have perfectly just institutions. There's a point of view that has some currency in Europe and in America, that public discussion is a quintessentially Western phenomenon which could be planted or cultivated, could not be planted or cultivated elsewhere. If that were really the case, there would be little hope of getting anywhere through global public discussion, since open public reasoning would be a culture constrained feature in the world. I believe that that diagnosis is altogether fallacious. Traditions of public discussion across the world exist and have done so for centuries, indeed millennia. For example, some of the earliest open general meetings aimed specifically at settling disputes between different points of view through public discussion took place in India in the so-called Buddhist Councils, where adherents of different points of view were invited to get together to argue out their differences. The first one was in the 6th century BC in Rajgir, the next one in 5th century BC in Vaishali, and the largest one was in 3rd century BC in Pataliputra, which is now Patna. Emperor Ashoka, who hosted the third and the largest in the capital, his capital city in Patna or Pataliputra, also tried to codify and propagate what were among the earliest formulations of rules for public discussion, some kind of an early version of the 19th century Robert's Rules of Order, namely that you have to listen to someone to finish the argument, even if you disagree with it, and even if you think that is completely wrong, you have to give him a listening. To choose another historical example, in early 7th century Japan, the Buddhist Prince Shotoku produced the so-called Constitution of 17 Articles. This was in 604 AD, 6 centuries before the Magna Carta. But much in the spirit of the Magna Carta to be signed in England in 1215 AD, 6 centuries later, the Constitution of 17 Articles in Japan insisted, I quote, "Decisions on important matters should not be made by the emperor or one person alone. They should be discussed with many." Other examples of the role of public discussion can be found in the history of many other countries. Indeed, the importance of public discussion is a recurrent theme in the history of many countries in the non-Western world. And this applies to Middle East as well, and as I give some examples in my book, and also to Africa. Indeed, in his autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, Nelson Mandela describes how impressed and influenced he was as a young boy by seeing the democratic nature through public discussion of the proceedings of local meetings that were held in the Regent's House, and there I defeat Machiavelli. It begins with 4 consonants, like M, P, Q, H, etc. I have no idea how it's pronounced, but that's where this discussion took place. And I quote from Mandela, "Everyone who wanted to speak did so. It was democracy in its purest form. The foundations of self-government was that all men were free to voice their option, and equal in their values as citizens," unquote. Mandela's understanding of democracy was hardly aided by the political practice he saw Western political practice that he saw around him in the apartheid state run by people of European origin, and people might have forgotten whites in South Africa used to describe themselves not as white but as European. And they were, of course, in European ancestry. But Mandela had nothing to learn from Pretoria. In fact, the European practice in Pretoria had nothing at all to match Machiavelli's cultivation of public discussion. The need for a global rearrangement that pays systematic attention to the concerns of the underdogs of the world relates to what can be broadly seen as global democracy, which is not an all-or-nothing choice, and that's very important to recognize. It is of course obvious that it's really impossible to have, in the foreseeable future, a global state, and therefore a fortiori, a global democratic state. However, if elements of democracy can be seen in terms of the pursuit of public reasoning in the global scale, then the practice of global democracy need not be put in indefinite cold storage. For this, we have to understand democracy as government by discussion, to follow John Stuart Mill. Though oddly enough, government by discussion is not a term that John Stuart Mill invented. It was actually Bagehot who invented it, but it was Mill whose writing fully explains to us. Bagehot came later than Mill. He was describing Mill, and he was saying that this is what this is all about, government by discussion. There's much scope for strengthening the coverage and effectiveness of global discussion, as I've discussed it and illustrated in my book. It's important for the voices of the adversely placed and disastrously affected count through interactive discourse, rather than only through violence, skirmishes, and threats of terrorist attacks, as often the case. One of the implications of the approach to justice I'm trying to explore is the need for and the importance of much more extensive public reasoning across the world. The role of global public reasoning, which is increasingly important in our thoroughly interdependent world, applies not only to the old problems of the world, our lives being nasty, brutish, and short, but also to our new global problems, such as environmental threats, such as terrorism, such as international slumps, and global pandemics. In fact, there are already elements of a global democracy in the world. You have to see it not an all or nothing thing, even though we may not always recognize its importance and relevance. Voices that can make a difference come from several roots, including global institutions, as well as less formal communications and interchange. These roots are not, of course, anywhere near perfect for the purpose of global argument, but they do exist and actually do operate with some effectiveness. And they can be made, and this is the important point, more productive through supporting them as important contributions to global public reasoning. And it is possible, we can get limited agreement on that, and it's absolutely necessary given the global threat of terrorism, environmental decline, and all the other problems I've been mentioning. The United Nations will not undoubtedly play a role here, but no one organization can be adequate for a satisfactory enlargement of global democracy and justice. Supplements do, in fact, come from other quarters. There is the committed works of citizens' organization, of independent parts of the news media, and of course, many activist NGOs. There's also the important role for the initiative taken by a great many activist individuals working together. Washington and London may have been irritated by the widely dispersed criticism in the world of the coalition strategy in Iraq, just as Paris or Tokyo or Beijing may be appalled by the spectacular vilification of global business in parts of the so-called anti-globalization protest, which incidentally is one of the most globalized movements in the world today. The points that the protesters make are not invariably cogent and compelling, and sometimes not at all. But many of them ask very relevant questions, and thus contribute constructively to public reasoning. Even the global features of the recent burst of the Occupy movement have had some influence in drawing more attention to issues of injustice and inequality in the world, despite the limitation of many of their chosen slogans. As it happens, the distribution of the benefits of international relations depends not only on domestic policies, but also on a variety of international social arrangements, including trade agreements, patent laws, global health initiative, international educational provision, facilities for technological dissemination, ecological environmental restraint, treatment of accumulated debts, and a whole host of concerns, including restraint, conflicts, and local wars. These are, just to give an example, one of the latest, I was one of the great supporters of the movement in Burma, where I grew up as a child for 3 years, when my father went there as a visiting professor, leaving University of Dhaka, where he was a professor. But and we were really arguing against the military dictatorship. But we have to wonder whether the issue about minorities, for example, the Rohingyas, get enough attention, certainly not from the military, not even perhaps from the democratic movement there, including from Aung San Suu Kyi, who I greatly admire. But her silence on that has been strong. But the non-silent has been Médecins Sans Frontières. They were providing medicine to them, and they were very upset when they were closed down. And that generated a public debate. That's the kind of global reasoning you need for the pursuit of global justice. Indeed, issues of global justice influence people's lives everywhere in the world, since we no longer live in self-contained little boxes. Our lives are globally interdependent, a point that David Hume made very sharply in an essay which should be read much more widely than it is, called Of Justice, written in 1751, and published just the year he died. In very early days, in very early days of modern globalization, he was arguing that now that we know each other, concerns of justice cannot neglect features, both because other human beings exist and have their claim, and also because we cannot interpret our life without looking at trade and our relationship with each other. Today, what happens in Egypt, or Syria, or Russia, or Ukraine, or Rwanda can deeply influence the lives of people in a great many other countries as well. Injustice anywhere, said Dr. Martin Luther King 50 years ago in April 1963 in a letter from Birmingham jail, injustice anywhere is threat to justice everywhere. It will be hard to find a more urgent intellectual agenda in the contemporary world than the demands of global justice. Thank you.
How does global justice, based on public reasoning, work in a place like Syria and or Somalia? Does the UN become more activist and interventionist? So, in a sense, I'm asking where this force began after we start reasoning.
Am I microphone? Right there, and I'm audible. Oh, that's brilliant. Yeah. You know, an invitation to public reasoning, which I'm doing, doesn't indicate I know the answer which would emerge on the basis of the public reasoning. I'm saying you have to address these questions. Let me give you an example, not from those two particular cases you took up. A few years ago, there was a Copenhagen. You know, I think that was a better position. I can see all of them together rather than... so I'm going to go back after this question because I want to see everyone's face together rather than saying, oh no, there was a question from there, oh I see, and so on.
I want to go where you want to go.
Okay, and you will presently, but I'll finish that. In Copenhagen, the Europeans wanted an agreement, and they were quite sensible. They wanted control in a way that America probably would not have accepted. I think Europeans would have been right in wanting that. On the other hand, they had no idea that there are many different types of contract you can have. About it's not social contract, not a perfectly just world, but a better world. The Chinese were saying, look, you Europeans have polluted the world for centuries. And the moment we start polluting, you say rules of the game have changed. You can't pollute anymore. There's also the question if the Chinese are allowed to do it in Indians and others. And then when Africa starts developing, how would they view Chinese and Indians as well as Europeans and Americans in a world? You have to need to discuss what would be a fair way of acceptable way for people to do. You need discussion. What we had in Copenhagen was a proposed contract without any discussion. So from this, it was held in December, I think. From the summer, I had to say that I really don't think it has any chance in hell, in being there. When I first time made the statement, I couldn't use that expression because this was a discussion arranged by the Archbishop of Canterbury. And it was in Lambeth Palace, so I say there's no chance anywhere, rather than in hell, that there would be that an agreement will go through, and it didn't. The Chinese wouldn't accept it, the Indians wouldn't accept it, Latin America wouldn't accept it, African wouldn't accept it, American wouldn't accept it, Europeans would accept it, but they put it there. So I think there's no way you can arrive at these decisions as to what was the right thing to do without actually publicly discussing it. Do I have personal views on those issues? Yes, I do. And certainly, and I have to say sometimes I did think, for example, in the case of Syria, though in general I think the Syrian government is an absolutely dreadful government, the Russians and the Chinese were right to insist that there be a dialogue on that subject, rather than what seemed to be for a while the US policy, namely a strike to destabilize the regime. We don't know what destabilization would produce. We didn't know what the impact of Al-Qaeda would have been as had there been in Iraq. There are all kinds of things to discuss, and we can't, it may be you might think the Russians got it accidentally right, which is possible. But as it happened, they were right to ask for discussion at that point. And I think the same thing applies in many other things, even in Ukraine. Now Americans have also come around to the view that there ought to be a discussion about Ukraine. And they're very difficult. I was looking at Tolstoy's writings about Crimea during the Crimean War. And it is not much doubt that it is seen as Russia in the way it's integrated together. And yet there is a real problem of decimation of the country, Ukraine. Then there's the history, 1954, the country got decimated. Khrushchev suddenly rearranged the states, and Crimea went to Ukraine. But that was within a country. So there are lots of things to discuss. Each of them we could have public discussion, and we clearly have to. That's my claim. So I'm not going to get a ready-made answer which will be acceptable to public discussion. I would demand public discussion, and if asked, I will give my views on that.
Just as a follow-up question,
cannot really go back, really. And now that my legs are probably working a bit better, I can probably actually move.
Tell me where you want.
Somewhere I can see the whole lot together. Very good. Thank you.
How do you respond to someone from Rwanda that would make the argument that there was too much public discussion why the wars to Biden allowed like the Hutus to kill the Tutsi?
Well, the Rwanda case, as you know, was there are many things to be accounted for still. Certainly, the role that the leadership of the President Kagame did, has certainly had an effect of stopping something, genocide at that time. That doesn't mean that what's happening right now is the most acceptable thing, taking into account the presence in neighboring states like Congo and so on. There's also the question of French complicity. The French played a gigantically positive role in Mali. On the other hand, the French role in Rwanda is very open to questioning. All these issues have to be discussed in the context. And I'm not going to, by the way, I also can tell you, since as I mentioned, like teaching different subjects. I did a course in maths, and I'm doing next a course in medicine, social medicine, with Paul Farmer, who is very active in Rwanda. And I gathered the improvement in healthcare have been quite dramatic. So that's also a consideration. I don't know which way to find. I can ask many more questions than I can answer, but I don't apologize for that. Because that is in the nature of human inquiry that I'm trying to present. So if I see myself in the light of Enlightenment tradition in Europe in 18th century of Hume and Smith and Condorcet and Wollstonecraft and Tom Paine and others, and I see myself also in the tradition of public discussion in Asia and Africa. It's a big tradition, but Mandela didn't say that even before discussions began, didn't he, an answer. You had to have the discussion. By the way, I left out one bit upon Mandela. He does say that there was one imperfection. Women did not speak. And that was, and when he used the word all men were free to speak, the term was used advisedly because women were not free, and he said that was a defect. On the other hand, to say that the Africans didn't have a tradition of public reasoning was monstrously false. That's the point that Mandela was making. Yeah.
I wanted to ask you a question about the relative standing of appeals to justice as opposed to humanity. I mean, typically, a humanitarian appeal is seen as somewhat differently from an appeal that's rooted in what is owed someone as a matter of right, of justice. And does it, in your distinction between the two approaches, the contractarian and the social choice approaches, I mean, I agreed very much with the idea that we should respond to injustice rather than trying to focus upon the creation of a perfectly just world. But historically, that appeal to humanity, quite apart from the just deserts of particular people, was an important aspect of humanitarian movements, social reform movements.
Yes. Humanitarian is a huge scope. I wasn't undermining that. But I'm not absolutely certain I followed the question, but let me give an answer, and if you say you answer a different question. Yeah.
If I had a microphone that worked, I guess now it does. Now, I'm thinking, you mentioned slavery, for example. And
you made what?
Slavery in the American context in the 1850s.
A slaver, slave owner, or slave.
When fugitive slaves came north, what was the obligation to receive them? I mean, there were contrary obligations written in the Constitution as a matter of justice to adhere to the constitutional command, and the constitutional command was that slaves be returned. The humanitarian claim was far different. That was something that arose from the humanity of the slave, and which required a response, even though it would require a violation of the North's obligation to the southern states who had joined them in making the Constitution together. So that would be a distinction between a claim made on the basis of justice and a claim made on the basis of humanity.
Yeah, I think there are three different issues. Humanity is going to figure in any of these ideas of justice. Humanitarianism is not something that follows just from the recognition of humanity, because recognition of humanity could be seen as something in common between us, or it could be seen as an obligation that we owe to each other, or it could be seen as something which would be good if we were to pursue, which is the way normally humanitarian is often understood. So say, gosh, he's a great humanitarian, I wish I could live like that. But that doesn't mean that you're leading a terrible life. It just means that there are certain ideas which you can link to humanity. So humanity is an invoked phrase. That's one thing. Secondly, as Adam Smith discussed in the theory of moral sentiment, the word justice has been used in many different ways. And the idea that justice is the overarching value in a political context was emerging at the time when Smith was writing in 1776 or 1759. And indeed, that is invoked in Kant in particular. It's also invoked in the Declaration of Independence. It's invoked in the French Declaration of the Rights of Man, and it declared in all the writings. Now, by the time people like Rawls and Dworkin and Nozick and others are writing, they're treating justice as the overarching. If you say this is unjust, this is actually much stronger claim than saying, oh well, it's unjust in some, it's unjust, but then it has many other virtues and so on. That argument becomes less and less available. A close friend of mine continued to, Bernard Williams, a great philosopher with whom I have a joint book on utilitarianism, continued to use justice as in the old classical sense of being one of the virtues in question. Now, no matter which idea of justice you take, and what place you get, humanity is going to figure in it somehow, because many of these will be claimed that you cannot treat another person like that, like Kantian statement, treat another person as an end, not as a means. A very strong statement. Now, so I don't think we could have lived in a different world where the terminology justice could have emerged very differently. But we live in a world today where to say something is really unjust, it's a very powerful critique, which you cannot say is unjust, but it's very efficient, but my God, it gets things done and wonderful, etc. You could say that, but there would be some skepticism. You could say, well, there is something terribly wrong about it. If you want, for example, say that a question that came up, the Chinese may not have democracy as America or India understands it. On the other hand, it has achieved many things that India has not been able to achieve. Now, if you wanted to say that it therefore is a just society, that immediately raises the question, what's the status of human rights? What's the status of multi-party politics? Despite the fact, without denying that China has done very much better than India in many scales. So I think I was taking the justice's major claim to be the principal political philosophy concern. On the other hand, we need not be in that territory. In that respect, I'm in the Rawlsian, Nozickian, Dworkinian territory. But you're quite right that we could think of that, and humanity is going to figure in all kinds of ways. But the whole interpretation of what the claim of humanity is again depends. For example, in the Buddhist philosophy, there's a strong claim that any animate object with sensory ability demands a recognition immediately, not by virtue of any link with humanity. Now, in that case, the uniqueness humanity is somewhat undermined by the uniqueness of sentient species. There have been some utilitarian thinkers. I think of a Vietnamese thinker. Their name consists of two consonants, namely NG, who actually it's a Chinese name originally, I think, and who had utilitarianism of sentient beings. Then you get a gigantic problem dealing with the world. So I think all these are discussable issues. You and I could chat on this a bit more. Despite the inaccessibility, I think justice would require that people get a chance.
Hi, thank you for your talk. I find it mostly very compelling, but it reminds me of an ongoing concern I've had about the assumptions underlying deliberative democracy, that those who come together to have this dialogue do so on equal footing, as opposed to with the existing relationships of power and injustice that the conversation itself is trying to address. I was wondering how we can come together and have this dialogue when the differences in power and differences in ability to speak are so pronounced.
I think I missed the critical issue there. Did you get it?
I think it's, if I understood it, it's how can you have an adequate discussion of the sort you're talking about when the people who are parties to it have unequal power in relation to each other. Is that reasonable?
Exactly, thank you, Tim.
Yeah. Well, there are three things to say. It is possible for people who are underdogs of society to speak. It is. And to say they don't have a power and therefore would not speak is completely to deny the significance of protest movement. Secondly, one of the ways of changing the world order is public criticism and inequality of power. Power is not only a source of strength, but it's also an eminent subject for discussion in the theory of justice. Power relations are absolutely central to any of these things. There's Anne Bevin, who was a minister in Britain at the time of the, sorry, I'm making a mistake, not Bevin, Bevan, where he was a minister at the time when the National Health Service came in and famously resigned because the National Health Service did not cover dental medical attention. Had a strong statement on which Michael Foot, his biographer, comments, to say the point of power is to give it away. Now, I spent some time thinking, what does it mean? The point of power, to give it away, if you have the power, then give it away. It really means that no one has the power over you, such that you cannot change it. So I think that Bevan's statement is, you need some kind of symmetry on the power, and giving it away doesn't take it away, because you still have that. Steve Biko, one of the great leaders of South African movement, had a statement saying that it's the powerlessness is this, that we may resent the way the Europeans or the whites in the country live. And nevertheless, we would call them boss when we meet them and reserve the right to swear at them only in the privacy of one's bathroom. So that is not having the power to be able to even express yourself. So power is, you're absolutely right, a very extensive feature. Any dialogue on justice has to have center things. But I think people who have talked about power as going against political philosophy, and whom I regard, they belong to me as I do too, on the whole, as radical political thinkers. But I think they have made a basic reactionary point, preventing a kind of discussion, which is really very important, and discouraging people. What do you wait for the revolution? That's the way the Soviets used to think, that nothing happened until there is revolution, and then things change. And we know what does happen after revolution. We not only ultimately it did good in France, but the reign of terror, what happened in the Soviet Union, what happened in China to start with, ultimately it may pave the way. So I think the idea that you cannot have a dialogue is false. And it's also false it's also very misleading to take people away from agitation, which is what it is. Agitation is the weapon of the powerless to get together to make a powerful point. So I think fundamentally, I disagree with your endorsement. I don't author you with that thing, but I'm saying maybe you and I should talk as to whether you should be so impressed by that argument.
Professor, thank you for coming here
Thank you.
and to give us such wisdom. In my travels around the world, I've been to South Africa, I've been in Ukraine, I've worked in Asia. I've seen a lot of injustice, and some of that injustice is a product of other people trying to find justice. When Bush went into Iraq and Afghanistan, he was looking for justice. I think Osama bin Laden, if we read enough about him, he was looking for justice as well. And you have a tremendous overcorrection, I think. A lot of injustice has been done in the pursuit of justice. Probably in this room, these young people here, maybe they too will be world leaders. I wondered if you could tell us a rule of thumb when we find ourselves on the wrong side of the pursuit of justice. How do we know when we're doing the wrong thing? How do we make sure that we're oriented towards justice and not taking away from or pursuing more than what we should be doing? And thank you for your time.
Yeah. Well, I don't think there would be any mechanical litmus test for that. I think the only way of finding it would be through reasoning as to why do you think that this is such a just thing to do if it's not. And that's happened again and again in the world. People have claimed one thing and ended up accepting an opposite claim. It's not the case, it never happens. I think a lot of the thing happens because people don't engage in what exactly is going on. Let me give you an example of the importance of public reasoning, since it had come up earlier too. Some years ago in Pakistan, there was a young woman who was caned in the Taliban-held Swat Valley in Pakistan. The military had the capability of coming in, but were very reluctant to do so, either because they didn't want to get into that, or because there were Taliban influence in the Pakistan army, which many members of the civil society in Pakistan believe. A number of such atrocities were carried out, being the caning of young girls for violating the moral norms of Taliban was one of the ones. The Pakistani civil society was aware of that. They were reporters. And they didn't like it, by and large. If there were a vote on that, that would have been rejected. But this wasn't on the top of the agenda in any way. Now, there is a Human Rights Commission in Pakistan, a very admirable organization, because unlike in India or South Africa, it has no legal standing at all, just an NGO. So it doesn't have any of the protection that the Indian Constitution or the South African Constitution or the Constitutional Court in South Africa or Supreme Court in India would give. So they have to work as an NGO. And the main weapon, of course, is public discussion. So a very courageous man went to one of the canings. And you can see him having a long conversation on a telephone. What he did was to take a video of the caning of this young girl. If he had been discovered, he would have lost his life. So this was a very courageous act. Then he came back and then put it on the video. So all the Pakistani major media carried it. And the result was a groundswell of opinion that you have to intervene right now. There wasn't any additional information. People did know that there were these caning. But it wasn't a reality which seeing the pictures became. So many of our conversations, many of our reasoning is stimulated by a fuller understanding of what's happening. One of the problems we suffer from in India greatly, that many issues, famine was immediately politicizable issue. There have been no famines in the British left. There was the last famine 3 years before the British left, which I experienced myself since I was a young boy at that time. But since then not. Why? Because famine got politicized straight away. But regular undernourishment, which is endemic in many parts of India, where no one is dying of that, but your mortality, your longevity may be affected because you're more prone to illness, your comprehension in schooling is affected, your cognitive development are affected. Very hard to make it a publicly realized failing. And this is a problem for public reasoning, it's a problem for democracy, because democracy proceeds on public reasoning. One of the advantages of a non-democratic system is that if the leadership is convinced, then it doesn't need to carry everyone understanding that. As the Chinese leadership today, who are very keen on eliminating undernourishment and lack of health care. They were not in the past, but they are now. But then again, with a non-democracy, we don't know whether the leader will go that way, will go like China today or North Korea today, or Cambodia yesterday, or China during the Great Leap Forward, in which 30 million people died of famines without anyone raising a question, single editorial against it, none. So I think you're asking a very deep question, how we have public reasoning. It requires discussion, but it's much more, and this question had come up right from the beginning, it requires much more than just saying, let's discuss. You have to understand what it is like to be in that position. So I think this is and a lot of, stories play a part. In this case, the video played a part. Public discussion can take many different forms. When I was Master of Trinity, which I think you kindly mentioned, it's a Christian college and I'm a non-believer, but I was technically the head of it. So I climbed up and sat at the same height as the preacher, but listened to music, and listened to speech. but didn't. And I had an altercation with the dean because the dean wanted me to read some parts of Bible, and I said there are parts of Bible I love, and I'd like to read it, but I have to choose them. And he said, no, you don't have to choose. You may be the master, but I choose them. I said, in that case, I'll be a listener. So I didn't. But then I went away, and new dean came, and he said, look, Amartya, you're no longer master, and you can now come back and choose anything you like, any part, and comment on it. So I gave a sermon. I gave a sermon on the Good Samaritan story. What is the story? It's very relevant to this. There is someone lying wounded. People don't help him but cross the street, the Levites and the priests and so on. They're all neighbors. They don't do anything. We're dealing it in the context of the two principles of gospel, that your two primary obligations are respect of God and being good to your neighbors. And then this Samaritan, who is not a neighbor, helps him. This is all an argument between Jesus and a lawyer. And at the end of it, Jesus asked an epistemological question, not an ethical question. Who do you think the wounded man, when he's full of senses, think to be his neighbor? And the lawyer has to concede that he will think that Samaritan was his neighbor. And I think the point that is made is that the neighborhood, if that's our duty, being to neighbors, depends on our relationship. Same point as the David Hume point, though he was famously, as you know, godless, and he didn't get his share in Oxford because he was godless. But the same point that as we come to know people, we cannot ignore them because we have a relation with them, and that's why he's praising global trade. We come to know people, we cannot ignore their lives because that way we know. If Smith is praising the efficiency of trade, and to some extent public discussion, but Hume is going all guns for opening up public reasoning about people we didn't know anything about. So I think when I say that public reasoning is central to understanding global justice, I don't recognize, I do recognize it's a very difficult problem. There are problems of asymmetry of power. There are problems about, Nagel's point, there's no global government. The newspapers are very often suppressed in many countries. In other countries, as in mine, in India, it's not suppressed, but it concentrates on the Hollywood as much as possible and the glitzy part, rather than you would not know that half the Indians don't have toilets at their home, which is a shocking story, not a newspaper item. So I think it's very difficult to get public discussion going. But that's the way we can go, and it's not about talking about perfect justice. And it's not about perfect equity of power either. How we can give more voice to the powerless in a world of great asymmetry of power and fortune. So that's the engagement. It's a difficult engagement, but that's what I'm inviting you to join.